Thanks for accessing this video for potential field supervisors for trainee projects on the University of Glasgow DClinPsy Module 11 on quality improvement. This replaces the previous Module 11 focus on service-based evaluation by broadening it out to include other activities that fall within quality improvement. As previously, the module seeks to generate projects from field supervisors based on actual service needs, as this provides a better and more applicable learning opportunity for trainees while benefiting the NHS and patients. The first formal call for proposals will be in September 2024, but we thought it would be useful to provide clarity as early as possible. There is also an exception in our APL trainees who have a slightly different path through the module and for whom projects will be carried out earlier, and I'll talk about that in this video too. So, how long does it take to make an improvement? While quality improvement encourages a philosophy of taking action, it's still important to recognise that doesn't mean that everything is dealt with very quickly. Often you take action only to uncover more things that could be done to support the improvement or help it last. And in some cases it will be very clear from the off that improvement is a multi-stage process that will take a good amount of time. After all, a full QI journey includes the following steps, each of which is, at least, its own enterprise. From the perspective of this module and trainee involvement, it's really useful to draw a distinction between an improvement you are attempting and the trainee QI project that may form just a part of this. So you are really needing to frame or carve out part of the wider, big, maybe messy improvement initiative into a somewhat neater, more time-constrained trainee QI project. Part of that process should be reflecting where things will be when the trainee or trainees are to carry out the project. For 3-year trainees, their project work will run from April to July in their final year, with project ideas developed over the prior autumn-winter semester. So the first project ideas will be proposed in the later part of 2024 to be delivered from late spring 2025. So there's no point proposing something that needs tackling by the new year or can't even be addressed for 18 months. So a philosophy of soon, but not now. Another factor is how substantive the project should be. Again, in almost all cases, it will not straddle the entirety of an improvement process. It will be a part of it that gives the trainee or trainees opportunities to meet the module ILOs, which are listed in our guidance document. And this doesn't require a large volume of activities, but it's about doing a reasonable amount of activity in the right way. The project is assessed by a presentation, and that will showcase some kind of QI output. So this is one good way to think about the substance of the project, what that output is going to be. For projects for 3-year trainees, these outputs are intended to be fully completed and final from their perspective, a final output of the methodology they put in. So a fully populated process map rather than a partially populated one. But another factor is time. The 3-year trainees will each have a maximum of 8 days a month put towards carrying out the project. And the early and later ones will be used for group forming and for write-up of the project towards their presentations. So that's an absolute maximum and doesn't factor in any other considerations. Now, working in groups will mean more resource to put into a project, but the time span doesn't really change. So projects need to include multiple activities that could be completed in parallel to each other, or single activities that are improved when more people are involved. For example, co-facilitation of larger focus groups. Remember, the substance of the project should really be finished over May, June and into July. That's when the actual kind of live part will really happen, with possibly a little bit happening towards the end of April as well. So let's take a hypothetical example, a fairly generic one. A service wants to reduce employee dissatisfaction. To do this, it wants to gather information from all staff, form a model of what the causes of dissatisfaction are, develop a set of aims and some proposed actions to address them, and then for each action, initiate a test of change while gathering data and then tweaking that change if necessary. So let's take one possible scenario, and in this one, the service is too busy to get this started without outside support. Luckily, they've formed a good plan for their team of trainees who will come in and collect data through meeting with staff and groups to identify the causes of the problem, using a fishbone diagram as the output they're developing. Now, it would be useful in this case to get further input from some other stakeholders, for example, the wellbeing champion. And because it's a trainee team of 3, this seems viable because they can divide their labour and complete the groups in parallel. So this activity is also included in the project. The trainee team facilitates 2 focus groups, a night shift and day shift group, while one member focuses on getting email feedback from other stakeholders. And this is developed into a diagram that they discuss with supervisors and then finalise this and think about what next steps could follow. Now, in situations where only one trainee happens to be available for this project, it would need scoping accordingly. Perhaps that they would not conduct the email feedback, maybe they'd reduce the focus groups or both, or it might be that it's not really viable for an individual. In another scenario, the service is well underway in this process. It may or may not have used QI tools to get there, but regardless, it's now at a point where it wants to initiate a test of change relating to use of the kitchen facilities. This is going to involve the PDSA cycle, and in this case, the plan component of the cycle is already partly defined because the proposed changes have been reviewed and signed off already by permanent members of a team, or perhaps a trainee in a previous project. So trainee involvement now will involve completing the planning stage by locking down what will be measured and when to measure that, then carrying out the measurement around the test of change and capturing this in an output. And in this case, it's appropriate to use a set of run charts to cover the numerical measurements that are going to be taken. And finally, these can be evaluated to decide what should follow. And that possibly would be another PDSA cycle, but this won't be the job of the trainees. The board are aware that in this case, they have a single trainee who needs a project, and reviewing the scope of this particular project and other factors, it's determined that this would be appropriate for them. If a group project was preferred, then supervisors might be thinking about other activities that could maybe happen in parallel. So could 2 tests of change be tried in different parts of the service, for instance? It may be that to do the single test of change well, there might be another approach that's a bit more in-depth, maybe collecting more measures or looking at things in a more intensive way. I think it's also just worth considering at this point that there can be a bit of a sliding scale of complexity with the outputs that are more related to planning. So I've mentioned a few of those, fishbone process maps and so on. So you can find more information about all of these online or with some links to our guidance documents. But a fishbone or a cause and effect diagram, we would view it's one of the more straightforward to develop. So that can be something that could be attempted more easily when resources are slim or even sometimes in combination with something else on top. A driver diagram, looking at options for making changes, that can be a little bit more challenging in the data collection, possibly a bit more back and forth, or a bit more finding consensus between people who might see things slightly differently. But the experience that we've gathered suggests that often it's fairly straightforward to reach enough of a consensus to have that agreed upon. Probably the trickiest of the main kinds of outputs for planning will be things like process maps. So that's how things are carried out, perhaps unspoken practices that are happening of how things are done in a particular service. And that can be really tricky if it's about reaching agreement across disparate staff groups who might engage with the process in different ways and may have very different views about it. So I think that's something to be mindful of as well, is anticipating if those kinds of things can be obstructions. And I guess it's worth saying at this stage that from the point of view of the course, as long as something is attempted and a methodology is carried out to its natural end, it's not a concern if it turns out that the service isn't quite happy to take it forward because there still is disagreement or the buy-in hasn't been reached yet. From the trainee point of view, if they've put in good faith to complete the activity, it's a final output, it's a final product from the programme perspective, and they wouldn't get penalised if it turned out that there was some contentious issues that were turned up. But I guess it's just worth bearing in mind that those things can sometimes be a bit more difficult to navigate. So to think a little bit about what might constitute a doable project with those factors in mind. So this right sizing isn't a precise process, and that's inevitable with any activity that escapes the classroom into the real world. And that's not really any different from the audits it replaces or our research projects and systematic reviews. They can just be a little bit different in what they're asking people to do, and some can be a little bit weightier or heftier than others. But we do have the opportunity in developing these projects to take a step back and try and adjust the frame as well as we can. And as an emphasis there, you wouldn't be doing this alone. This would be something that myself directly as module coordinator and potentially other members of the program staff would be very involved in helping try and get this down to something that feels right for the trainee or trainees at hand. So I want to say a little bit more on the APL trainees. So they have a slightly different progress through the course with respect to this module. So they won't be doing it at the end of their training. They will be doing it a little earlier. So their initial project ideas could be put forward by NHS Psychology Services or by staff on the DClinPsy programme or by the APL trainee themselves. And it would need to be a proposal that the trainee has some links to the service in question. So either they're on placement or have been recently on placement with that service, or via their employment contract or alignment. There's some sense of a connection. It shouldn't just be an idea that appeals to them, but they don't really have any contact with, because just pragmatically, we want to make it as easy as possible for this to fit together for everyone. And this work will be done individually. In this case, it certainly will be individual for APLs to do their project at a time that suits them, either in their second year or their third year. And that ensures that they've had an opportunity to complete all the QI teaching before they begin this. It could be connected to a first year placement, but it's year 2 or year 3 where they actually get to do it. And something that's really important to bear in mind for APLs, that they will have a lot less time to put towards this than the 3-year trainees. So we'll be asking in this kind of first iteration that trainees keep about 3 or 4 study days allocated towards this project. So that's mindful of the other demands that they'll have on their time. Now, if there is an agreement that can be put in place that placement days can also be put towards this. So in some instances, and I can speak for myself, one of my specialist placements, I did QI activities with no academic output. This was before we made this module change. So if that can naturally work and it seems appropriate that they put more time towards a service improvement and it fits the development of their competencies, that's brilliant. And we would be very happy for that, although that will be a decision for those involved in those placement decisions. But just to be mindful that barring those kinds of situations, we really want to make sure that we're not putting a great deal of this kind of service development work onto the APLs with the expectation that they'll be completing it in study days, because they will just have a limited amount of time. So these projects really should be conceived as a default, as a short project lasting just a couple of months. And one consequence is that for these trainees, it's been agreed and signed off that it's totally fine for their output to be unfinished. So it should be something coherent, so not just some scribbled notes, but, for example, an initial draft of a planning diagram. And it's also important that the trainee has a sense of why it's unfinished, what's unfinished about it. So to be able to say, when they present this work, that to progress the project further, the next step would be, and then to describe what that would be. So to understand it's part of a process, not just something that has been dabbled with, but it's putting something in place that would be brought to life through additional work to build on it. And if the output was related to a PDSA cycle, it might be that there's just a single target measure chosen with no other balancing or process measures to be considered. or it might be a shorter run of measurement that might be a bit less revealing, but still could point towards something. And whatever it is, it's a way of still allowing the trainee to apply the QA methodology. And I guess that's the key with all of this, that we're still, the priority is to carry something through in a QI way, even if the output is at an earlier stage of development. There are a number of text resources, documents, which you can access through your local area tutor for the board or by contacting me, which should be a lot of help and supplement this video. And the final thing is just to think about next steps, which for the 3-year trainees is to keep in mind projects for their final year, and for APL trainees to contact me to discuss ideas for an APL in your board, and just to reach out to me for any other queries. Thanks very much.